Is teaching an art or is it a science? I'd like to say that it's both. We have craft knowledge, which tells us what works, and we have professional or scientific knowledge, with which we explain why this works. Let's start by looking at some professional scientific knowledge, which we can then use to explain why mind maps are valuable tools. We often teach as if learning can occur by transmission, but in fact it cannot. The learner has to construct their own understanding. The information processing model helps us to understand this. According to this, inputs come via the senses, and if we pay attention to them, that enters our very short sensory memory. If we pay further attention and select, that information can light up what we're thinking about at any one moment, which is called our working memory. Working memory's capacity is extremely small, and it has a very short duration. We can only hold about 5 to 7 items at once in our working memory, meaning what we're thinking about at any moment. Real learning happens when that information is encoded into long-term memory. We can say that there are 2 types of learning, rote and meaningful learning. What distinguishes these two is whether the new information is linked meaningfully to prior knowledge or not. Prior knowledge is what's stored inside our long-term memory. We can liken this to what happens inside a carpenter's workshop. The shelves are somewhat like the long-term memory, and the table is somewhat like the short-term memory. In order to make something useful, the carpenter, the learner, needs to use tools and skills to link elements which are in the working memory, which he gets from outside and which he gets from the long-term memory. And he links those together to make items which are then usable. This diagram shows another important aspect of learning and teaching. At the top we have the teacher. Here we can see the things that are lighting up in his mind as he's speaking. At the bottom we see the learner. As the learner is listening to the teacher, he thinks the teacher is meaning the things that are lighting up in his mind there. You can see there's not a perfect correspondence. That's what we call the pedagogical gap. How do we narrow that gap? We need dialogue. We need the teacher and the learner to communicate with one another and that way negotiate meaning. Get to understand what each is understanding, the other one is thinking. Another very valuable concept to understanding learning and teaching is the zone of proximal development. The yellow area represents what is already known. Just beyond that is what we call the zone of proximal development. When we teach learners, there's not much use in us teaching them what they already know. So meaningful teaching actually happens within the zone of proximal development, but that can only happen within a social setting. In other words, learners need help when they are operating in the zone of proximal development. And that gets us to the concept of scaffolding. Scaffolding means guidance that the teacher gives the learners and gradually fades that guidance as it is no longer needed. Now let's apply this to mind maps. Mind maps can come in very many different forms. They generally consist of terms put inside some kind of shape with links, arrows with linking words written on them. You can include pictures and colors. This is one done in Excel. When you hover over, you get a pop-up box giving you more information. This one's done in PowerPoint, and you can hyperlink it, click on the various things, it takes you to other information. So you can get variations of them. But why are these tools valuable? We can look at both the process and the product of the mind map and explain why each of those are valuable in terms of the theories we've spoken about. Let's speak about the process first. As the learner makes a mind map, they are forced to make links between concepts, new information and prior knowledge, and hopefully that encourages meaningful learning to happen. Also, especially if the learner does this in a little group, there's the negotiation of meaning that happens as the learner speaks about what they think the link should be, and that can help reduce the pedagogical gap. Then let's speak about the product. Having a mind map is also valuable because it gives a roadmap of how the various concepts relate with one another concisely and diagrammatically in a way that reduces cognitive load. In other words, doesn't take up too much space in working memory. Also, it can serve as a communication tool so that the teacher can see what the learner thinks the links are between items, and that can serve as a dialogical tool to narrow the pedagogical gap. How do we get learners to learn how to mind map? We are operating in the zone of proximal development when we try to teach learners to do mind maps for the first time. So we need to provide some scaffolding. I'm going to now describe my craft knowledge of what I found worked with my learners as I tried to teach them to mind map. I started by modeling the process. I gave them some text and I asked them to underline the keywords. I then got the keywords from them and wrote that down. You can use pieces of cardboard with some kind of sticky stuff at the back, and in that way you can move the concepts around and replace them. I then asked them to tell me some kind of hierarchy, what's the most important, what falls under that, and that way I arranged the concepts. I then asked them what would be logical ways to link the various concepts with one another. In this way, I interactively created a mind map in front of them. Then you can get them to copy that down, or you can photostat it for them and hand it out the next day. I then asked them to create a list of criteria of what made that mind map good. And they shared that in little groups, and then with the whole class. We wrote down the list, modified it, and that was our list of criteria. I then gave them practice. I gave them another piece of text and said, go through the same process yourself now. Choose out the keywords, write them on little pieces of perhaps sticky notes or something like that, which you can move around. Arrange them in a hierarchical way. Choose linking words that are logical, and then link that. It's to be expected that they'll have to redraw it and move things around a bit. It doesn't come right just the first time. Then came the stage of assessment. I reminded them of our criteria and then got them first to assess themselves and make changes where appropriate. They passed around their mind maps to one another, assessed them, discussed ways to improve. I then also made them choose the best out of the group, pass that to other groups so that you got a bit of modeling of good practice amongst the peers. Here's a list of linking words that I found helpful to give to the learners. And this is the list of criteria for good mind mapping that my learners and I came up with. First of all, it must be concise, that we can understand in terms of the limited capacity of short-term memory. The links between the concepts are very important, and they must be logical, because really learning and understanding is about the relationship between concepts. The mind map should be comprehensive, covering the topic thoroughly, although concisely. There should be consistency in the mind map. One might use shapes or colors, maybe to show hierarchy or perhaps to show how things are related to one another, but this should be used in a way that has meaning rather than just for prettiness. There should be some kind of structure, for example, a hierarchy. And the value of that can be understood in terms of the way in which we retrieve information. There's evidence that shows that it's easier to retrieve information if the concepts are structured hierarchically in the long-term memory. And finally, there should be a fair amount of interlinking. And again, this links with research which shows that it's easier to recall and manipulate information if it's highly interlinked.